Today's session, we would be discussing the elements of cost. So far, we have learned cost, costing, cost accounting. We've discussed the classification. Last session, we had spoken about the various methods that are adopted in determining the cost. So today's session, we will be focusing on the concept of elements of cost. Now, elements of cost, your understanding about elements of cost uh, forms the crux of understanding the subject of cost accounting. So, for you to understand the subject of cost accounting, for you to be able to seamlessly carry out the practices of cost accounting, it is very important for you to have a good understanding about what is meant by elements of cost. In chemistry, we would have studied the elements of we would have studied the concept of elements. So we saw, or you would have already learned in our lower classes, that matter that we see as on today, it is made up of elements. So elements will form the building blocks. Okay, so elements according to chemistry, so or your elements like nitrogen, your elements like hydrogen, your elements like oxygen, your elements like chlorine, all this will form the building blocks of matter. So for example, if you take water, water comprises of the element hydrogen and oxygen. So only if hydrogen and oxygen, these two elements will come together in a fixed proportion of 2:1, that we would have water in place. So likewise, in cost accounting, for us to carry out the practices of cost accounting, we should understand what are the building blocks of a subject. We have to have a good understanding about what are the building blocks of subject. So let me get on to explain to you what is meant by elements of cost. Elements of cost helps you to differentiate and then bifurcate the cost. So these elements are designed, these elements are created such that you would be able to differentiate and you would be able to categorize your cost. You would be able to differentiate the cost. You would be able to categorically group the costs into various categories and then go about studying them in detail. So if you do not have elements of cost in place, it becomes very difficult for us to record cost. Okay, it will become very difficult for us to record the cost. So if you have to go about reporting costs, if you have to go about carrying out cost analysis, which are the objectives, which forms the scope of the subject, it is very important for us to understanding about the elements of cost. When we get on to learning cost sheet, you will understand why the categorization of elements of cost is very important. Now, if the management has to go about carrying out their activity well, then they must have a good understanding about the elements of cost. So without the elements of cost, it becomes very difficult for us to go about with the activity of recording costs. If you do not record costs, it becomes very difficult for us to bifurcate, to study the cost in detail. Okay. So for the management to carry out their decision-making processes, for them to generate data to carry out a decision-making process, for all these aspects, elements of cost is very important. Now, in cost accounting, there are three elements of cost. In cost accounting, there are three elements of cost: material, labor, expense. So there are three elements of cost. The three elements of cost are material, labor, expense. Okay? So in a nutshell, elements of cost will form the building blocks of cost accounting as a subject. If you do not have elements of cost, it becomes very difficult for us to differentiate and bifurcate costs. Then there are three elements of cost. The three elements are material, labor, and then expense. Now, one more important thing that I would like to emphasize at this point of time is that each element is divided into direct and indirect cost. Each element is further classified into direct and indirect cost. So if you take up material, you have direct material, you have indirect material. If you pick up labor, you have direct labor, you have indirect labor. So each element of cost is further divided into direct and indirect. So how do we go about classifying them into direct? How do we go about classifying them indirect? How do we identify which element does it belong to? We will be learning on all that in the coming session. Now let's first talk about material cost. In a nutshell, material cost refers to the cost of commodities supplied to an undertaking. Now, you're an organization, you're a business, you're in the process of manufacturing, you may be in the process of production. For you to carry out your routine process in place, you may need the input of some commodity. You may need certain items as your raw material. So this material that is supplied to you, the cost that is incurred in supplying that material to you is referred to as a material cost. These material costs, it would be consumed in the long run as a part of your production process. Okay, so as and when you carry out your manufacturing activity, as and when you carry out your routine production process, what would happen is these materials would eventually get consumed. Okay, so it will eventually get consumed. So in a nutshell, material cost refers to the cost that is incurred by a business as a part of rendering a service or producing a good. Okay, so as a part of producing a good, as a part of rendering a service to its client, the cost that is consumed, the cost of the materials which are consumed is referred to as material cost. Material cost can be further divided as direct and indirect cost. It can be further divided as direct material, indirect material. So let's pick up on some examples. For example, you may be wishing to make tea at home, but for you to make tea at home, for you to carry out the process of making tea, there may be some inputs that you would be requiring. You would be needing milk, you may be needing water, you would be needing tea powder, you may needing sugar. Maybe if you'd like to add some seasoning, you would like to make a masala tea or something, you may have to add some cardamom, you may have to add some cinnamon. So all that would be there as a part of your production process. But what would happen with all these items that I just mentioned, in the due process of making tea, eventually all these items will get consumed. All these items will end up getting used up. Okay? So that is what is meant by material cost. So material cost refers to the cost of material which is consumed as a part of your production process, which is used by an organization. So any organization that you pick up, it may need some kind of material. So let's say if you were to go to a complex production activity like manufacturing of automobile, there may be different varieties of raw material that may be needed. You may be needing the frames, you may be needing nuts, you may be needing bolts, you may be needing screws, you may be needing electrical wires, you may be needing bulbs, you may be needing tires, you would be needing plastic parts, etc. So all this would be the materials which are consumed as a part of producing cars. So in a nutshell, all this put together is what is called as material cost of your organization. I had explained to you material, any element of cost that you pick up, it can be further divided into direct and indirect. It can be further divided into direct material, indirect material. So we'll try to learn each of these in detail. Okay, so what is meant by direct material? So direct material, basically these are components, or these are raw material which are consumed, which are vital for your production process. You cannot carry out your production process without the direct material in place. It will be difficult. You cannot think about executing your production process without direct material. Another important aspect about direct material is whenever you end up consuming direct material in your production process, you would be able to quantify it perfectly. You would be able to pinpoint, you would be able to allocate, you would be able to exactly state and say, this is the amount of cost that I have incurred in producing so many units of the product. Now, so for example, let's say, maybe I'll pick up of an example in terms of cooking, okay? Because it's post lunchtime. We all must have had a good meal. So and then we would be able to correlate this with easily. Imagine you decide to make sambar at home. So for you to make sambar at home, you may need a variety. You may need an assortment of vegetables. You may need carrot, you may need beans, you may need brinjal, you may need drumstick, you may need pumpkin, you may need ashgar. So different material would be needed for you to produce that sambar. Now, you are able to quantify and say that so much of material I would be using for my activity, I will be using for my production process. So for example, for your making sambar, you must have brought 200 grams of brinjal, half a kg of carrot, maybe 3 or 4 drumsticks. So you're able to pinpoint and you're able to quantify and you're able to say exactly what is the volume or what is the quantity of material that would be consumed as a part of your production process. So direct materials has the unique characteristics of being able to be quantified appropriately or exactly. Okay, so any material that is consumed as a part of your production process, you're able to quantify it perfectly. That is referred to as direct material cost. Then you have indirect material. So indirect material, these are needed. They may not be so essential, but these are still needed. Okay? It is so indirect material are those materials which are needed. It is a part of your production process. Two characteristics is that one is it may not be so vital. It may not be so vital. Next thing is that you may not be able to quantify the exact quantity of, or you may not be able to quantify the exact cost of the indirect material which is consumed. You may not be able to pinpoint and quantify it perfectly. So for example, previously I had picked up on the example of sambar. Now, for you to prepare delicious sambar, it is very important for you to add salt to it, or you may have to add your spices like turmeric, chili powder, all that. But in those cases, you're not able to quantify it perfectly. I mean, you may know the quantity in terms of maybe number of spoons, but you're not able to assign it a fixed cost. Okay? So for example, one bag of salt will cost you 20 rupees, and out of that 20 rupees bag of salt, you may have taken 2 spoons of salt. But that salt which is consumed, you're not able to quantify it perfectly. Okay? This is exactly what happens if you were to approach a carpenter to make some furniture. So if you were to approach a carpenter to make some furniture for home, let's say you want to build a wardrobe at home, you approach a carpenter, the carpenter would be able to tell you the exact quantity of wood which would be needed. Excuse me. He would be able to quantify and tell you what is the exact quantity of wood that would be needed. But he may not be able to quantify and tell you what is the exact number of nails which are needed. Okay? He would not, let's say you call a carpenter, you would ask him an estimate. He would say, okay, I would need 3 sheets of plywood, such and such grade. But he will not tell you that I need exactly 23 nails. That would be very absurd. So in such cases, or in certain cases, what happens is certain proportion of components which are consumed as a part of your production process, you may not be able to quantify it perfectly. Because you're not able to quantify it perfectly, you're not able to determine the exact cost which is associated with it. So here in my slide, I have given the example of nails which are used by the carpenter as a part of making furniture. He may not be able to give you the exact exact cost of the indirect material which is consumed. So I picked up on the example of furniture. So if you were to go to a carpenter and you would request him to make some furniture for you, he will tell you, okay, I need 2 sheets of plywood, and the 2 sheets of plywood will cost you so much and so much. But he will not tell you, like, I also need 23 nails. So for 23 nails, you have to spend 10 rupees. He will not do that. Okay? That's because it's an indirect material which is consumed as a part of his production process. So because of which he's not able to quantify, he's not able to quantify, he's not able to allocate a fixed cost for that. So that's about material. That's about material cost. Okay, so that's about material cost. So material cost refers to the cost which is consumed, cost of the raw material which is consumed as a part of your production process. It is of two types. You have direct material, you have indirect material. Direct material are any material that you're able to quantify perfectly, you're able to allocate cost perfectly. It is called as direct material. Indirect material, it is needed as a part of your production process, but you're not able to assign fixed cost to it. It is referred to as indirect material. The next element of cost that we have to learn is labor cost. Okay? The next element of cost that we would have to learn is the labor cost. What is meant by labor cost? Labor cost refers to the cost incurred by your organization in the form of remuneration, which has to be paid to your employees or laborers. So labor cost refers to the cost that is paid by your organization, the cost that is incurred by your company as a part of remuneration paid to the employees. Now, you cannot run an organization without labor. Your labor is a vital part of your organization. Without having the skilled labor or having skilled employees or having the rightly qualified people to carry out your activity, your organization, your business cannot function at all. So it becomes very difficult for your organization to function. So labor forms a very important component of your organization. Now, in fact, when you analyze the cost of producing goods in your company or rendering service in your company, what would happen is labor would form the major portion of your cost. Okay, labor would form the major portion of your cost. So maximum amount of your money, maximum amount of your income, you may have to spend that to remunerate your employees. You may have to spend the maximum amount of money to pay a remuneration to the people who are working for you. Now, when you're paying compensation to your employees, it is mandatory for you to pay a fair compensation. What is meant by that? Which means there are some standards which are set, there are some baselines which are set. If you cannot afford to go about paying less than this. Now, in the case of the unorganized sector, in the case of certain factory jobs, what happens is the government has fixed certain guidelines. A factory cannot, or a manufacturing firm cannot afford to pay their employees less than that. You can take it is ensured by the law. It is enforced by the law. So you have to ensure that you pay a fair compensation to your employees. And in certain cases, some portions of this compensation is guaranteed by the government. Now, the compensation that you pay to your employees, it could depend on the labor class. It could depend on a number of factors. It could depend on the qualification. It could depend on number of years of experience. It could sometimes even depend on the kind of profile that you do. So just in case if you are involved in certain dangerous, or if you're involved in certain jobs which are high profile, which is highly risk prone, the compensation that gets paid to you would be relatively high. I remember having an uncle who worked as a geologist, and he worked for an oil exploration company. And I remember the remuneration that he paid, it was almost 3 to 4 times that of what he would have earned in a normal industry. Why? Because most of his jobs, in most of his time, he would have to spend on these oil rigs which are offshore, and there's a huge amount of risk which is involved. There's a huge amount of risk which is associated with that. So there are a number of factors on which the compensation that you pay to your employees would be determined or would be estimated. So it could be qualification, it could be years of experience, it could be the profile of the job, etc. So depending on all this, sometimes what happens is the price, the remuneration that is paid to the employees gets determined. Again, labor can be classified into two. You have direct and then you have the indirect labor. Okay, you have direct and then you have indirect labor. Now, talking about we will learn a little bit more in detail what is meant by direct labor, what is meant by indirect labor. Now, in the case of when you are able to identify and when you are able to remunerate the working class who are involved directly with your production process, all such labor cost is referred to as direct labor cost. You are able to pinpoint and say, okay, this person, he was involved in this activity, as a result of which he is entitled to such and such amount of compensation. Now, there are certain parts of your labor that you're able to identify and you're able to pinpoint and say exactly. Okay, so for example, a mason who's doing the plastering work at home. You know that he is involved in the plastering work. That is an activity that is determined, that is an activity you're able to identify. So the compensation that you pay to him would be a direct labor cost. An example that I've given over here in the presentation is teachers in the department. So you have maybe we have around 25 teachers in the management department, and we know all these teachers, they are associated, they are involved in teaching the students of BBA. We are able to allocate their remunerations perfectly. That is referred to as a direct labor cost. Sometimes it so happens that you may need a group of people to support your direct labor. Okay? You may need a group of people to support your direct labor. So to this supporting category of people, you may have to pay some compensation, you may have to pay some remuneration. So that is referred to as indirect labor cost. Now, indirect labor cost, one unique aspect about this is that you may not be able to associate, you may not be able to tag it to an individual cost center. So for example, I picked up on the example of teachers in the department. Let me continue for indirect labor as well in the same line. To calculate the teacher's salary, we may need a payroll employee, an employee in the payroll department. Now, that employee has to be paid some salary. He has to be paid some compensation. He or she has to be given a fair remuneration. So the salary that is paid to the employee working in the payroll department, the payroll section, would be an indirect labor, because this employee is not directly involved or engaged in the activity of the teaching. However, if this person is not there, the entire organization may not be able to function smoothly. So this labor, this compensation that gets paid is called as indirect labor. Okay, it is called as indirect labor. So labor refers to the compensation, the remuneration that you pay to your employees, and it could be of two types. You have direct labor and then you have indirect labor. Next, we have what is referred to as expenses. Okay, next, we have what is referred to as expenses. Expenses, in a nutshell, refers to the cost of service that you have provided as a part of rendering your routine manufacturing or services. Okay? So sometimes for your organization to function smoothly, you may have to create certain provisions, you may have to create certain facilities, and to manage these facilities, to manage these resources, to manage these provisions, you may have to incur some kind of cost. Okay, so the role of the expenses element of cost expenses is that they help or they provide the adequate support which is needed for the existing production process. Okay, now I'll pick up on an example for this. Let's say you are a manufacturing firm, and in your manufacturing firm you have around 50 employees who are working. Now, for these 50 employees, you may have to create some provision for refreshments. They have to be provided with food, they may have to be provided with snacks, they have to be provided with tea, coffee, etc. So you're forced to run a canteen, you're forced to run a cafeteria. Now, cafeteria has got nothing to do with your production process, but there has to be someone there to run the cafeteria. You must hire a chef, you must hire a cook, you must hire a supplier, you must hire a waiter, you may have to buy benches, you may have to buy chairs, you may have to provide lighting, someone has to do the housekeeping over there. So now that cafeteria has become an expense for you. Why? Because without the cafeteria, your labor cannot function smoothly. So if they have to refresh themselves, if they have to enjoy some nourishment, if they have to enjoy some food, it is mandatory for them to visit cafeteria. Okay? So this is what is meant by expenses. Expenses again can be broadly divided into two. You have direct and then you have indirect. Okay? Expenses can be again divided into two. You have direct and then you have indirect. Now we will talk about what is direct and what is indirect. Sometimes some of these expenses that you're incurring, you're able to allocate, you're able to identify it definitely with a process. Okay, you're able to identify it with a definite process. You're able to identify the cost and you're able to tag it with a fixed or with a definite cost center. So such kinds of expenses are called as direct expenses. So let me explain this with an example. You had some machinery which was a part of your production process. This machinery broke down. You have to subject the machinery now to some repair. You're forced to subject the machinery now to some repair activity. Now, without the machinery, you cannot carry out your production process. Without that machinery, you cannot carry out the production process. So if you do not repair the machinery, your production process cannot be carried out. It cannot be executed. It cannot go on. Your production activity cannot go on. So the cost of now repairing that machinery is a direct expense for you. Okay? You know that machinery is needed and you know it is a part of your production process, it is a part of your production department. The cost that you're incurring in repairing the machinery is now becoming a direct expense. Now, any expense which cannot be associated exclusively with the process, it is called as indirect expense. An expense that you have incurred, you're not able to tag it with a definite process. Such kind of expenses are referred to as indirect expense. So let me pick up on a classic example for this. If you are a manufacturing firm and if you must, or for you to function, you decide to take a telephone. Now, telephone has got nothing to do with your production process. But since you have taken the telephone at your organization, you have to pay the bill for it. Someone has to foot the bill. If you do not foot the bill, what will happen is your service provider would come, they would disconnect your connection and they would go off. So it is important for you to foot the bill. So now the telephone expense, it has got nothing to do with your production process. It has got nothing to do with your production process, but for you to function effectively, efficiently, you still need a telephone and someone has to pay the telephone bill, and now the telephone bill has become your indirect expense. Okay? The telephone bill has now become your indirect expense. Now, let me give you an overview of the elements of cost. So whenever we talk about elements of cost, there are three elements: material, labor, expense. Now, each of these categories, you can broadly divide that as direct and indirect. Okay? You can divide that as direct and indirect. Moving on, now let's talk about the divisions of cost. So what we have learned so far was the elements of cost. Now what we are going to be learning is what is meant by divisions of cost. Okay? What we are going to be learning now is the divisions of cost. Now, I told you that the cost of an organization can be broadly divided into three elements. You have material, you have labor, you have expenses. Now, divisions of cost we have so that the elements can be categorized for your evaluation process, for your analysis purpose, and then you can go about carrying out your decision-making processes, or you can go about your decision-making activity. Now, at this juncture, I want to talk about something which is called as overhead. Tomorrow, maybe in less than a year, when you join organizations, this is one common term that you would be hearing frequently. This would be one common term that you would be hearing every now and then. The concept of overheads. Now, what is meant by overhead? Overhead is indirect cost that is incurred for running a business. Okay? Cost that you're incurring for running a business is referred to as a overhead. Okay, it is referred to as a overhead. So overhead refers to indirect expenses of running a business. Okay? The cost of running a business when you have some indirect expenses which are associated, it is called as overhead. Now, overhead, you cannot pinpoint, you cannot associate it directly with a production process. It is still needed. In other words, these are overheads, are expenses which are incurred as a part of your regular production activity. If you do not incur these overheads, it could so happen that you may not be able to function. Here in my presentation, I have given the example of telephone bill in a factory producing tiles. Owning a telephone has got nothing to do with your production of tiles. But if you do not have a telephone, you may not be able to communicate effectively. So now your telephone bill has become an overhead. So likewise in organizations as well, organizations would have different overheads. So for example, the remuneration, the compensation that you pay to your senior management, CEOs, VPs, your CEO is not going to come and then carry out your production process. CEO has got nothing to do with your production process, but CEO is there to manage the day-to-day activities of the organization, to give the business a sense of direction. So if the CEO is not there, the business cannot function smoothly. The organization may not be able to function effectively. So now the remuneration that you're paying to the CEO is overhead for you. It is an overhead for you, because without having a CEO, there will be no one to manage the day-to-day activities of your business, the day-to-day activities of your organization, as a result of which you may not be able to function smoothly or effectively. So this is what is meant by overhead. Now, talking a little bit more about divisions of cost, you can divide costs into two broad areas. You have something which is called as prime cost, and then you have what is called as overhead cost. Okay, you have prime cost and then you have overhead cost. So a cost which is involved or which comprises of your direct material, direct labor, direct expense, this is referred to as prime cost. Whenever you sum up all your indirect costs, that is referred to as overhead cost. Okay, that is referred to as overhead cost. So costs in an organization can be broadly divided into two. You have prime cost and then you have overhead cost. Prime cost comprises of your direct material, direct labor, direct expense. Overhead comprises of your indirect material, indirect labor, indirect expense. Moving further, now this division of cost that I've displayed here on the screen, this is very important for you to go about preparation of your cost sheet. So if you sum up the three direct costs, you will get prime cost. Okay? If you sum up all the three direct costs, you will get the prime cost. To the prime cost, if you add your factory overheads, your indirect costs that you incur at the factory level. Now again, factory overheads can be of three. You can have indirect factory material, indirect factory labor, indirect factory expenses. So prime cost plus your factory overhead, you will get factory cost. Factory cost plus admin overhead, you will get cost of production. Cost of production plus your selling and distribution overhead, you will get your total cost. Okay, so this is another division of cost that we have discussed. Now, I will be discussing the division of cost once again a little bit more detail in the next session. So before we wind up this session, let us do a quick recap of what we have learned. We learned elements of cost. We saw that elements of cost are used in differentiating or bifurcating the cost. Elements, it will help you to record cost better. It will help you to carry your management to function effectively or smoothly. We saw there are three elements: material, labor, and expense. And we saw that each of this can be further divided into direct as well as indirect. Material cost refers to the cost that is incurred as a part of the raw materials which are consumed. This can be direct and indirect in nature. Direct are those which can be tagged directly with your production process, but any other material that you consume as a part of your production activity, it is called as indirect material. Then you have what is called as labor cost. Again, labor cost refers to the remuneration that you pay to your employees. Labor is of two types. You have direct labor, you have indirect labor, you have expenses. These are expenses that you would incur as a part of providing a service to your production process. Again, expenses are of two types. You have direct expense, you have indirect expense. So elements of cost, in a nutshell, this is how it looks like. Then we have spoken about divisions of cost. I told you cost can be divided into different categories. The elements of cost can be divided into different categories. This will help you to carry out an evaluation as well as your decision-making process effectively. Anything which is any expense that you incur as a part of supporting your business, these are referred to as overheads. We spoke about prime cost, we spoke about overheads. We saw sum total of all your direct elements of cost is referred to as prime cost. Overhead cost refers to indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expense. Okay. So with that note, we've come to the end of today's session.